All right, so this is Endocrine Part 2 and your last lecture with me. You might be getting kind of tired of hearing me talk, but I hope you come back and you take anatomy too. All right, so this section here, we're going to be looking at glands and looking a little deeper at those stress responses in our body. So next here, we've got the pituitary gland. The pituitary regulates the functions of other endocrine glands, kind of like the conductor of an orchestra. We often call it the master gland. Although the hypothalamus often stimulates the pituitary, so it's got a little helper. You know, sometimes conductors will have somebody that will stand in for them. And so the pituitary gland lies at the base of the brain in the sella turcica. And you can see that right here, okay? And so we have the anterior portion of the gland right here, and the posterior, of course, on the posterior side. So it's got two distinct portions, and we've already talked a little bit about how you need to pay attention and differentiate where these hormones are coming from. You can't just say the pituitary. You need to say, is it the anterior lobe or the posterior lobe? And of course, we have some extra names here. Anterior lobe is also called the adenohypophysis, and the posterior lobe is called the neurohypophysis, but you will normally just hear me say anterior and posterior pituitary. We don't need to make it that complicated. But you do need to know that those mean the same things. So the anterior lobe secretes hormones like growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, that's our TSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and prolactin. Only the anterior lobe produces hormones, okay? Only the anterior lobe produces. So we're going to put that one here. This one produces. This is important. Okay? Produces hormones. All right? Both release. Both release. One just receives messages from the hypothalamus and the other from the nervous system. So nerve cells in the hypothalamus. Same but different. The posterior lobe contains the ends of nerve cells coming from the hypothalamus. Both are endocrine glands that control other endocrine glands. So these are kind of like the top dogs. The hypothalamus is going to send hormones directly to the posterior lobe through the nerves, and then the posterior pituitary gland is going to release them. ADH and oxytocin are secreted by neurosecretory cells, so that's secretory or nervous cells that secrete. Oxytocin, we talked about that. Let's see. The anterior lobe, I think we've covered everything here. So remember that hormones act on specific target cells. Some have an inhibitory effect, and we can see here in the red, these red arrows show us inhibition. So like prolactin release is an inhibiting hormone. Some stimulate the pituitary to release hormones that then stimulate different endocrine glands. And so in green here, we can see some stimulating hormones. These tend to kind of balance each other out and, of course, cause opposite effects. Peripheral endocrine glands are those that are outside, peripheral to the side, the nervous system. Negative feedback helps to regulate the hormone levels in the bloodstream and keep them in that range where they need to be. So the anterior lobe is enclosed by a collagenous capsule that is made of epithelial tissue that is organized around thin blood vessels. Each lobe hormone is released in response to a releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus. Epithelial tissues have secretory cells embedded in it. Growth hormone is going to act to enhance the movement of amino acids into cells. Increase the rate of protein synthesis. It can increase the rate of fat metabolism. Prolactin requires a releasing hormone from hypothalamus for the secretion of milk, and that's inhibited by dopamine from the hypothalamus. And so remember, dopamine is one of those feel-good chemicals in our brain, and so this is why it's often a bonding experience for mother and child, is because we have these hormones released as we are nursing our babies. TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, stimulates the thyroid to produce thyroxine, and that's your T4, and triiodothyronine, and that is T3. These stimulate metabolism in many tissues. If you have a very high metabolic rate, very thin, protruding eyes, these are symptoms of a hyperthyroid and having these levels off. ADH, that's adrenocorticotropic hormone, that stimulates water reabsorption. I've mentioned that a few times, so that might tell you something. You got to know what these hormones are. LH, that's our luteinizing hormone, and that promotes steroid production like testosterone. It can also stimulate ovulation. FSH primarily affects those that's follicle-stimulated hormone. Affects those reproductive organs, stimulating the egg to grow and trigger production of estrogen. LH and FSH are what we call gonadotropins. They act on the gonads, and that can be either egg cells or that can be sperm, whatever the reproductives are according to whatever sex you are. The mechanism that regulates secretion of gonadotropins is not quite fully understood yet. This diagram here overviews and shows hormones that are released from the hypothalamus, the corresponding hormones that are then released from the anterior pituitary, and the organs that they affect. And so you can also see here that we have the green section showing what is going to be stimulating, and the red section which is going to be an inhibiting type action. So this is a good little summary slide. So the posterior pituitary is made mostly of nerve fibers and some neuroglia, which are some non-neuronal cells for the nervous system. So it consists of those. It's got nerve fibers that originate in the hypothalamus, and two hormones here are produced. Antidiuretic hormone, remember that's vasopressin, and that's tied to our blood pressure, and then oxytocin. Here's another really good summary chart here. If we look at ADH, our antidiuretic hormone, I've talked a little bit about that. It's tied to our blood pressure. We call this vasopressin. It presses the vessel, so it causes vasoconstriction, right? Vasoconstriction. So if it's constricting, it's lowering the amount of pressure, and it's lowering the amount of blood concentration that's reaching an area. Diuretic, so antidiuretic. Diuretic means to pass urine. So diuretics increase urine production. So this helps control body fluid concentration and blood pressure. So if it's an antidiuretic, it stops the function of diuresis, enuresis, passing urine. Oxytocin is down here. It can act as an antidiuretic actually, but just to a much lesser extent. It causes those contractions in the uterine wall and the milk-producing glands and ducts that we've discussed, causing that milk letdown response. So those are two really interesting ones on this chart. Do review all of these and be sure that you know all of these. All right, so here we're looking at the thyroid gland. It's kind of butterfly shaped, and it lies just below the larynx here. It produces three hormones, T4, which is the thyroxine, T3, which is the triiodothyronine, and then calcitonin. We have connective tissue covering the gland, which is made up of follicles that are filled with a clear, viscous colloid type fluid. It has follicular cells that produce and secrete hormones of the follicles. We also have C cells, which are extra follicular cells. That means they're outside of the follicles, and those also can secrete some hormones. So thyroid hormones are directly tied to our metabolism. T3 and T4 affect those metabolic rates. These help regulate metabolism of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. They help increase the rate of energy released from carbohydrates, the rate of protein synthesis, and the breakdown of lipids. These are most important, or the most important factors that determine how many calories are used at rate. And that is what we call our basal metabolic rate. Basal metabolic rate. And this is why some people can eat the same amount of food as others and not gain weight. The thyroid also produces calcitonin, which is most important in the control of calcium and phosphate concentrations in the blood. It can decrease the rate that calcium and phosphate leave bones, or increase the rate that they are deposited into bones. So you can have a thyroid that works at too high of a level, and we call that a hyperthyroid, or you can have a thyroid that works at too low of a level, and that would be hypothyroid. So if these are some examples here. Hyperthyroidism, you're going to see a very high metabolic weights. You're going to lose you're going to lose weight, be very sensitive to heat. You're not going to rest well. You're going to be hyperactive. You can see that you could have these protruding eyes, as in this picture here. Okay. And one cause of this is Graves' disease. Hypothyroid is when your thyroid is working at too low of a rate. Okay. This can, if you are a child or an infant, it can stunt your growth and cause abnormal bone formation, because remember, this is tied to calcitonin. It can cause intellectual disabilities and sluggishness. Now, once you're a little older, you're going to see things like you're going to gain weight because your metabolic weight is slow, cold all the time, sluggish, you have a poor appetite, and you kind of have a fog in your mind and in your brain. You can get a goiter with these, and that's due to a deficiency of thyroid hormones due to iodine. And so this is why we have iodized salt. And so a simple goiter is most prevalent where the soil lacks iodine. And so this is why we came up with iodized salt. And so you should be sure when you buy salt to always get iodized salts, because you do not want to have issues with your thyroid. And when you do have problems with your thyroid, you usually have to go on medication for the rest of your life. It is not something that you can ignore. Thyroid problems can cause things like heart problems, hair to fall out, lots of different problems, and things like the heart problems and the stress on your organs can be quite serious. So the parathyroid glands are found on the bottom of the thyroid, the posterior surface, and they secrete parathyroid hormone, PTH. This acts to increase blood calcium and decrease phosphate concentration, so it helps regulate bone resorption. And you can see these here. These are like these little nodules on here. This is the thyroid. Okay, you can only see part of it. And these little nodules, that's the parathyroid. So this picture here is showing the pathway for the parathyroid and the connection to vitamin D, and actually getting out in the sunlight, where it's important to control absorption of calcium in the intestines. And so this is why we often talk about getting your vitamin D from the sun. It's not that you get your vitamin D, it's that ultraviolet light triggers the release of that vitamin D, or the absorption of that vitamin D, I should say, that we get directly from foods, but then we have to have the ultraviolet light in order to get it converted. It's going to be a provitamin or precursor in the skin, and then it needs to be activated, and so then it becomes the full vitamin. And so this is important for calcium absorption. All right, so here we're looking at how the parathyroid hormone stimulates bone to release its calcium and the kidneys to conserve calcium. It is indirectly stimulating the intestine to absorb calcium. All right. The resulting increase in blood calcium concentration is going to act to inhibit secretion of PTH, or parathyroid hormone, by negative feedback. All right. So here you can see stimulation in red, in green, inhibition in red. So here this is showing that negative feedback regulation of cortisol secretion, pretty similar to thyroid secretion. So the adrenal glands are pretty closely associated with the kidneys, and what that means is they are kind of attached to or sitting on top of the kidneys. It's kind of like a little cap. Hormones are secreted from two different areas of this gland, the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Numerous hormones then are secreted by the adrenal glands, but we've got to remember we have those two sections here. We've got the cortex, and that's going to be right here, the outer portion, and medulla, think middle. So medulla is in the middle. So the adrenal medulla has cells grouped around different blood vessels, or around blood vessels that are connected to the sympathetic portion of the autonomic nervous system. And they have some modified neurons that are called chromaffin cells, and those lead to the central nervous system. The adrenal cortex is the larger portion of the gland, and it has three layers. It has the zona glomerulosa, which is going to be the outer layer, the zona fasciculata, which is the middle, and the zona reticularis, which is the inner. And so I remember that as GFR. But you have to be careful with that, because the GFR also stands for glomerular filtration rate. I just think GFR, NFR, and it just helps to remember we've got glomerulosis, fasciculata, reticularis. It's just a good little acronym to remember. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are both secreted by those chromaffin cells. These are what we call catecholamines, and those are often secreted when we have that fight or flight response. So a physical or emotional stress triggers that. They have similar effects like increased heart rate, increased force of contraction, elevated blood pressure, increased breathing rate, decreased digestion, and these last a long time, so 10 times longer than any other neurotransmitter. And you might need a long time if you are trying to escape a predator, for instance. So they have similar actions but stimulate different types of receptors. And so this chart here is showing those different actions and that they're going to have. What function is going to be affected, and how is it going to be affected? So there are some hormones that we have to have in order to sustain life. If they're absent, death can occur within about a week. Aldosterone is synthesized or made in that zona glomerulosa. So remember, GFR is the top zone, the outer zone, is what we call a mineral corticoid. It regulates electrolytes, things like sodium, potassium, and we know that sodium, potassium regulation is very important, because if that gets off, things like your heart can just stop if your potassium is off by way too much. Also stimulates the kidney to hold on to sodium, excrete potassium. Secretion of aldosterone is linked to that renin-angiotensin system, which is what regulates blood pressure. And we know we have to have blood pressure in order to life. That is important, because that's how we get oxygen everywhere. So cortisol, next, that's a glucocorticoid, gluco meaning glucose, so it regulates glucose metabolism, as well as, of course, protein and fat metabolism. It's produced in that middle zone, so GF, F is next, and that's the zona fasciculata. So G, this is in the G, and this is in the F zone, all right? So adrenal androgens is next, and these are male sex hormones, and those are produced in the inner zone. And so these are going to be in the R zone, okay? The zona reticularis. These are actually converted into female sex hormones like estrogen. And of course, these stimulate early development of reproductive organs. So here's another action diagram. This one is involving angiotensin and some of the other molecules, angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2. This system actually gets kind of quite complex. So blue is showing the release into the bloodstream. Green is showing a stimulation. Red is inhibition. So aldosterone increases blood volume and pressure by promoting the conservation of sodium atoms and sodium ions and water. And so this is what we're seeing here through steps 1 through 4. First, it's going to decrease blood pressure and sodium ion concentration, and that stimulates the secretion of renin. All right. Renin then is going to trigger angiotensin II to stimulate the adrenal cortical cells to secrete aldosterone. Then aldosterone acts on the kidney specifically and tells it to conserve or to hold on to sodium ions and therefore water, because remember, water, salt follows salt. So then blood pressure or sodium ion concentration can return towards normal, which inhibits further secretion of renin. So that sodium concentration is the reason why some people with high blood pressure have to watch how much sodium they eat. But this does not affect everyone with high blood pressure. There are so many components that come together and even have a synergistic effect and act together to cause high blood pressure. It's quite complex, and so you can only see how it affects it. Basically, the best way to do it is just to try to avoid too much sodium, because it may or may not be the person that it can affect your blood pressure and drive it up even more. And they have a cumulative effect. So you could have 3 different things that cause high blood pressure. If you add in that sodium and it happens to be something that will cause yours to go up, that could be the one thing that makes it just soar up way too high. Because like I said, they have a synergistic or a cumulative effect upon each other. It's quite a complex system, actually. So we do have some different disorders of the adrenal cortex. Something like Addison's disease is where the adrenal cortex doesn't secrete enough hormones. This is often autoimmune in nature, which means your body tags something that's supposed to be self as non-self. The symptoms here include things like decreased blood pressure, decreases in sodium levels, increased potassium levels, hypoglycemia, dehydration, fatigue, loss of appetite, and even death can occur when your electrolyte balances are severely off, okay? When they're severely off balance. Cushing syndrome is caused by hypersecretion of the cortical hormones or oversecretion of ACTH by the anterior pituitary. Tumors can actually cause these changes in secretion, or if you take too many corticosteroid drugs for a long time. When we say corticosteroid drugs, we're talking about typically when you take steroids, and we're not talking about a 5-day or 10-day dose pack. We're talking about high doses for a very long time. Symptoms of Cushing is going to be high glucose levels, excess sodium retention, which is therefore going to cause puffy, swollen skin, high blood pressure. Adipose tissue is deposited into the face or into the back, giving you a moon face or a buffalo hump, which is kind of what is shown here in this picture when you get that little buffalo hump there. That is a fat buildup. So the pancreas functions as a part of the endocrine system and part of the digestive system. So remember, the exocrine secretes to the outside of the body through a duct, and endocrine releases hormones into bodily fluids. So the pancreas is an elongated, partially flattened organ posterior to the stomach, and it kind of looks like that. It's kind of shaped like that. The duodenum is a duct that actually attaches to the pancreas, or attaches the pancreas to the small intestines, attaches the two together. So the endocrine portion of this has pancreatic islets, or islets of Langerhans. And this has 3 types of hormone producing or hormone secreting cells, I should say, secreting. Alpha cells secrete glucagon, beta secrete insulin, and delta secrete somatostatin. All right, so the hormone secreting cells of the pancreas are grouped into clusters. And you can see this pretty well on this one right here. We've got a pancreatic islet, or islet of Langerhans. These are closely associated with blood vessels, so they're near blood vessels. Other pancreatic cells secrete digestive enzymes into ducts. So secretion of glucagon, which is stored in the muscle cells, causes the liver to break glucagon down into glucose, which causes an increase in blood glucose concentration. So if we need sugar in our system, if our blood glucose has dropped low many hours after a meal, this is what's going to happen to bring it back up. Secretion of insulin can cause a decrease in the concentration of blood glucose. So insulin is a protein, and its effects are the opposite of glucagon. And glycogen is what's stored in the muscles. I'm not sure if I said those, if I called it glucagon, but glycogen is the form that's stored in muscles. Somatostatin is secreted by delta cells, and that regulates glucose metabolism by inhibiting the secretion of glucagon and insulin. Okay, and so those have opposite effects. Glucagon stimulates the liver to break down glycogen from muscle cells and convert it into sugar to increase blood sugar. Insulin is going to promote the formation of glycogen and put that into muscles to lower blood glucose concentration. So insulin and glucagon function together to stabilize that blood glucose concentration. And this is the negative feedback loop here. Negative feedback responds to blood glucose concentration. It controls the levels of the hormones, of both hormones. Low glucose stimulates the release of glucagon from alpha cells. When it returns to normal, glucagon secretion decreases, and this is very important during exercise or between meals. So diabetes mellitus results in urine with a high osmotic pressure. This is why people that have diabetes often go to the restroom a lot. This is caused by a disorder of the immune system. The pancreas, and this is what we call classic diabetes type 1, the pancreas cannot produce enough insulin, so it is not able to keep up with the blood glucose concentration. This is also what we call juvenile onset diabetes because it usually occurs before the age of 25. This is not caused by anything the person does. We don't fully understand how it works, but usually there is a genetic predisposal, and then some event like a virus triggers a change where the pancreas no longer functions correctly. So it is autoimmune in nature. The immune system actually attacks and destroys the pancreatic beta cells, which stops insulin production or secretion. Glycogen then is not formed to store excess glucose, so it remains in the blood and spills over into the urine, increasing urine volume. Water, remember we say water follows salt, and remember that applies to other ions, so water follows glucose, even though it's not an ion. Water follows sugar as well. By osmosis, and that causes dehydration and thirst. Type 2 diabetes mellitus results from the cells becoming insensitive to insulin. And this usually starts in people over 40, although we are seeing this occurring in much younger people because we have such an increase in the consumption of sugar. Cells lose insulin receptors, and so they become what we call insulin resistant. This is actually reversible. You can actually lose weight and change your diet, and many times see this completely reverse. So this is a very controllable disease. Type 1 diabetes, this is where you are going to be insulin dependent for the rest of your life. And type 2, again, that is more, we do have predispositions, genetic predispositions to having this insulin resistance, but this is much easier to control, and like I said, it can actually be reversed in many cases. All right, so here are the minor players, the more minor endocrine glands. We've got the pineal gland, which is very, very small, I think peanut, and I think tiny, is located deep in the cerebral hemisphere. It secretes melatonin, and you might be familiar with melatonin that people can actually pick up at the store and take to help them go to sleep. Melatonin is a very important component of circadian rhythms, and circadian rhythms are our basic sleep and wake cycles. This is why you go to bed at a certain time and wake up at a certain time. I am the type of person, I have very, very strong wake and sleep cycles. If it is between 5 and 6 in the morning, if the sun comes up, I will be awake. It doesn't matter if I go to bed at 3 or if I go to bed at 8 the night before, I'm going to be awake. I have a very strong circadian rhythm here. The thymus gland secretes hormones called thyroxines, and these help control metabolism. The thymus gland is found posterior of the sternum and secretes thymosins that affect the production and differentiation of white blood cells. And it is important in immunity. And immunity, we are talking about T cells, and this is where they get their name, T cells for the thymus gland. So reproductive organs also secrete some hormones. They can secrete testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and gonadotropin. Other organs like digestive glands, small intestines, heart, and kidney also all secrete some hormones. The heart secretes atrial natriuretic peptide, which is A&P, and that is directly tied to natriuresis, is that water balance, the water and ion balance. And so this can decrease extracellular fluid by increasing sodium excretion, by releasing more sodium. And then the kidneys secrete erythropoietin. Remember, erythro means red, so we're talking about red blood cells, and so that is actually tied to red blood cell production. So our survival depends on maintaining that constant internal environment, that homeostasis. Factors that change the internal environment can be life-threatening. We actually call these stressors. And like I said, there is a good stress and bad stress. One of the most stressful events in your 24-hour daily period is actually wakening, because there is a lot of things going on into waking up in your body biochemically, okay? So we're not talking about just stress in the general connotation of the word. We're talking about factors changing the internal environment. So sensing danger is going to send direct nerve impulses to the hypothalamus, and this is going to trigger the release of many hormones, which can trigger a loss of homeostasis. So stress is a conditioned, and it is an important response that is produced due to environmental stressors. And sometimes it doesn't even have to be environmental, it can even be just up here, right? And so you will even see long-term effects, especially in children that are growing up with constant stress, and it basically wires their brains in a different way than normal, and it makes them a little more prone to having problems related to stress. So it is very important for small children to not have daily stress. And when we say daily stress, we're talking about like abusive things, okay? Abuse. So stress can have a physical cause or be psychological, or even both. Physical stress is hard on the tissues, extreme heat or cold, low oxygen, infection, injuries. Physiological stress results from real and even imagined dangers, personal losses, unpleasant or lack of social interactions. And so all of these things can trigger hormonal releases in our body. During a stressful event, whether physiological or physical, the hypothalamus helps prepare the body for that fight or flight syndrome. It triggers sympathetic impulses to go to various organs. It also stimulates the release of epinephrine, which intensifies that sympathetic response. Your blood pressure goes up, and we'll look in Anatomy 2 in a little bit more detail about that fight or flight response. The hypothalamus also stimulates the adrenal cortex to release cortisol, which then promotes a longer-term response that resist the effects of that stress. This is a good review slide here for some of the major events in stress syndrome. I'm not going to read all this to you. You can read, but I would be sure that you read this one. All right, so how do things change over the period of our life? Aging affects hormones in particular ways. Growth hormones tend to surge at night. but those surges do tend to lessen with age. And of course, we know that we have hormones that cause us to go into puberty, and then those are going to die off once we finish that prepubescent and period that we're going through. The thyroid actually shrinks with age, and thyroid nodules can actually become more common as you age. Melatonin levels even out, and so that actually changes the control of the sleep-wake cycle. You will see that people require less sleep as they age, and older people, geriatric populations, will tend to sleep for shorter periods of time, and then so they'll nap throughout the day, but they don't sleep for such long periods of time as they once did. And so this is actually the last slide in the last chapter. You have made it through summer anatomy and physiology. Congratulations. All you've got left to do now is study for that final, and hopefully you've been working hard all these 8 weeks, and so you're going to be well prepared for that. But I want to give you a hand clap, because doing anatomy in 8 weeks is very challenging, and if you've stuck in there and hung it out and you've been working hard, then you have something to be very proud of. And we sure hope to see you back here for anatomy too. Hopefully in person, maybe we can be on campus for that. Anyway, so have a great afternoon. Good luck on your test.